This recording is part 3 in a series that covers the lymphatic system. The first 2 parts discuss some lymphatic pathways, and the second part discussed lymphatic tissues and organs. For this part, we're actually going to look at the cells of the lymphatic system, the lymphocytes, and also just an introduction to immune systems. We're going to look look at the difference between specific, or otherwise known as adaptive immunity, versus innate immunity. So if you're interested, there I will post a video that's on YouTube that kind of gives you a brief overview of the lymphatic system. Lymphocytes are the cells of the lymphatic system. So again, notice it says lymph, okay? So the lymphocytes are the second most populous white blood cells that we have in our blood, with the most numerous being neutrophils, but lymphocytes is the second most populous, about 20 to 30% of your circulating white blood cells. But of the total population of lymphocytes that we have, it's actually a relatively small fraction, because a large number of the lymphocytes are associated with those lymphatic tissues and lymphatic organs. Now let's look at, before we kind of look at the different subtypes of lymphocytes, is the lymphocytes are very long-lived. They can last up to a number of years, and they can divide, so which is kind of important. So if we encounter a pathogen, the lymphocytes will divide. Some of them will stay behind for in case you're exposed to it again, and the other ones will divide, try to fight off the condition. A large number of them, like I had mentioned, are found in lymphatic tissues or organs, and they are stationary. So kind of the classes of lymphocytes that you see is we have T lymphocytes, or T cells. We have B lymphocytes, or B cells, and then we also have natural killer cells. Now, natural killer cells here are actually part of our innate immunity, or non-specific immunity. The T cells and B cells are specific, so these will be specific. We have populations of B cells that will only recognize, say, like Staph aureus. It's going to recognize a specific bacteria, and the same goes with T cells. Now, of the circulating lymphocytes, most of them are T cells, and we have 4 types. So cytotoxic, if you break down the word, cyto means cell, toxic things, toxic. These are cells that do not feel bad about getting their hands dirty. They will go direct contact with cells and kill them. So they will attack cells that appear to be foreign, or cells in our body that have been infected. Now, the T cells, I do want to mention that T cells are involved what we call cell-mediated immunity. And the T cells, or the cytotoxic T cells, will go after cells that have been infected. They don't really go for things that are just in your body fluids. It's usually infected cells or foreign cells. Now, helper T cells are very important. Now, they will activate and stimulate other T cells and B cells. It'll activate or stimulate the cytotoxic T cells. It will stimulate the B cells. The helper T cells are a bridge between our innate and our specific immunity. They will, we'll find this out later, is they will activate components of our innate immune system, but also activate things associated with the specific immune system. Now, the suppressor T cells instruct the cytotoxic T cells to be tolerant of questionables, the things that are like, well, they're not a threat, so calm down, cytotoxic T cell. They're not a threat, be okay, just ignore it. But suppressor T cells also are going to be important when we have actually fought off a potential infection, and now we need to kind of inhibit the activity of our T and B cells. Now, memory cells, these are cells that respond to a previously encountered antigen. So when we mount an immune response, we do produce memory cells that will be there for subsequent exposure, and that's why we can act so quickly and not actually get sick a second time. And that's actually a basis behind, if you think about when you get a vaccination, is we will mount an immune response and develop memory cells, so when you are exposed to that pathogen again, you never really get sick. Now, B lymphocytes or B cells, these are cells that are part of what we call humoral immunity or antibody-mediated immunity. When B cells become activated, which they need these helper T cells to become activated, is they will develop into what we call plasma cells. So if you look at this cell, it looks a lot different than here, but we will produce memory B cells for a time when we encounter that pathogen again. But the plasma cells will produce and secrete lots of antibodies, which will kill pathogens, and those are pathogens that are in our body fluids. So T cells, the cytotoxic T cells, like to look at infected cells, virally infected cells. B cells tend to like more bacterial infections and things that are in our tissue fluids. Now, the lifespan and circulation of those lymphocytes, as I mentioned previously, is the majority of our circulating lymphocytes, about 80%, are T cells. Now, most of our B cells and T cells, though, are in lymphatic tissues or lymphatic organs. Now, the T cells do circulate faster. Okay, so they circulate faster than the B cells. And if we look at the ratio of B to T cells in different lymphatic structures or organs, there'll be a little bit of a difference. So, for example, in the spleen, you have a 1-to-1 ratio of T to B cells, about the same amount. The spleen, remember, will filter blood, doesn't filter lymph, but it filters blood and will react to any potential pathogen. Now, the thymus, which I don't have here, but the thymus is where the T lymphocytes develop. That obviously is mostly T cells. Now, blood, which we see like right in here, it is mostly T cells, and it's about an 8-to-1 ratio. So 8 T cells for every 1 B cell. Bone marrow, where the B cells mature, you're going to have more B cells. So in bone marrow, you have a 1-to-3 ratio, with more of them being B cells. Now, the lifespan I had mentioned previously, they have very long lifespans, and they say average is about maybe 4 years, but some can actually be greater than 20 years. So they last quite a long time. Now, the production of those lymphocytes is, I had kind of mentioned it, talked about it previously, is all the lymphocytes ultimately originated in the red bone marrow. Okay, so the red bone marrow, you see here a little picture, that's in that proximal epiphysis of a long bone, but in adults, the red bone marrow, primarily we find a lot more red bone marrow in our flat bones. In children, we'll have red bone marrow, a lot of it actually throughout the length of the long bones. But what happens in the red bone marrow, we have these multipotent hematopoietic stem cells. So these are cells that have the ability to become multiple different things under the right stimulating factor. Well, what you have here are some lymphoid stem cells, and you don't have to memorize this interleukin 7, so you don't have to worry about that. But some of those lymphoid stem cells will travel to the thymus. So here's your thymus right there. And the thymus produces thymosins, which will stimulate that maturation of T cells. And think of it as these platoons of T cells going off to Fort Thymus to complete their basic training. And they're going to leave as your cytotoxic T cells, your suppressor T cells, your helper T cells. And those T cells are, what I had mentioned previously, are part of cell-mediated immunity. They will go up close and personal and kill off those potentially infected cells or any abnormally looking cells. Now, in the red bone marrow, the B cells and the natural killer cells, this is where they actually mature. And then they will go out into the bloodstream and circulate, and a lot of them will take up residence in peripheral tissues. And the B cells are part of what I had mentioned as antibody-mediated immunity or humoral immunity. And they're going to be killing things off using the use of these here are antibodies. Now, natural killer cells are part of our innate immunity, while the other two are part of we call specific or adaptive immunity. So one of the things we'll talk about is innate defenses and innate immunity, and natural killer cells are part of that. They're involved in immune surveillance. They will kind of circulate around, and if they find things that don't look quite right, they will kill it, but they don't differentiate between things. If you don't look right, we're going to kill you. They're not going to be specific to certain pathogens, so they will kill things off. So they're a part of our innate immune system. Now, just kind of an overview of our body defenses is using the terminology that I had mentioned before is adaptive versus innate immunity. And think of it as, think of it as like when we're doing the immune system, like the military. And think of adaptive and innate immunity as two divisions that fight the same battle, but innate immunity, they're going to be, they don't differentiate between pathogens, while adaptive immunity is more specific. And some people use the analogy that innate immunity is like when you answer the phone. You pick up the phone, you answer the phone the same way. Hi, this is so-and-so, how can I help you? Versus a specific immunity or adaptive immunity, you're looking at caller ID, and you're going to respond differently depending on who the particular caller is. You might not pick up the phone, or you're going to respond a little bit differently. So the adaptive immunity, though, requires prior exposure to an antigen, or you have received some antibodies. Now, these are not present at birth. You have to acquire this. Innate immunity, those defenses are present at birth and does not require any prior exposure to an antigen or antibodies to be produced. What we're going to do in the next recording is going to look at the innate immunity, look at this non-specific resistance to disease, and in the subsequent one, we're going to look at specific immunity.